again, if they're not using API Manager, ColdFusion API Manager, there's obviously security best practices that can be, done in ColdFusion itself. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Again, I know I'm repeating myself again, but this is really important. Step one is let's figure out what APIs we're using and what APIs we're offering. And let's look at the code and see, do we still need those? And if we do, then what controls, this is again, outside of API Manager, what controls can we apply within ColdFusion's capabilities itself, But, again, as I say, flogging a dead horse, that audit is really important.
ColdFusion Alive, the podcast for the ColdFusion community. Discover practices, tools, techniques, tips and trends for modern ColdFusion development. Brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Here is your host, the founder of TerraTech, Michaela Light.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Mike Brunt, and we're going to be talking about API security in ColdFusion, which you may not have considered. This is a whole other attack surface that your apps can be hacked by. Mike has been doing ColdFusion for basically forever, since version 1.5, 25 years ago or thereabouts. And he used to work for a company called Alaire, which some of you may remember were the people who created the original ColdFusion. Then he worked for Macromedia. I don't know if you actually worked for Adobe, Mike, or not, but he used to fly around the country fixing people's slow ColdFusion servers and did a lot of work for Fortune 1000 companies in the United States, maybe in other countries too. He's a JVM expert, blockchain expert, does a lot of troubleshooting kind of stuff. So in addition, he is a composer and musician and has published 11 albums and painted 100 paintings. And also he's got a heavy interest in permaculture and self-sustainable food. A Renaissance man, I would say. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. That was a rather lovely introduction, Matt. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So you're welcome. What does why is it so important to look at security of your APIs in your ColdFusion apps?
Well, my experience has been, as you just rightly said, I've been to many places over many years, in terms of helping people. And I've seen the increase in the use of APIs. And let's look at two ends if we can. So let's look at a remote API. So somebody's giving us as a client an API that we can connect to. Most people that I've seen, and this is not a criticism, that they assume that the endpoint, that the person offering the API has secured it. It's sort of a given assumption, and what typically happens in that case is the API gets dropped into the code, and it's like, and that's it. It's left there. So there's not really, and again, I'm not being critical. There's not really a lot of attention paid to securing remote APIs. The other end of things, which is obviously if we're offering APIs, again, we're sort of relying on the development team. And again, these aren't critical statements at all. But again, we're relying on ourselves securing the API that we're offering. And both those different types of APIs, both remote and API interfaces we may be offering, are open to security attacks, not just from inside our code, but from, anything that may be out there. So it's almost a bit like, to use a term in my experience, it's like set and forget, APIs get interspersed in the code, and then often, and this is a classic with code anyway, often they can get left open when they're not needed anymore, and I've seen that too. So, and there's various articles from people like Gartner and so on about the increasing use of APIs and the increasing security threats that brings. So that's been my experience with them, and we really need something that's easy to use to apply security. And it's not just security. The one thing about, if I may mention it, the ColdFusion API Manager is it allows all sorts of fine-grained control of APIs, both external and internal. So things like adding roles to so that only certain items can use that API, for instance.
Well, we'll get into that in a bit more detail in the show and talk about some of the potential attacks that you've seen out there. But just to mention that statistic that you pulled up from TechRadar, it was a 200% increase year on year in API use, and that the average organization is using over 15,000 APIs in all their apps organization-wide. So this is an enormous attack surface that's out there, and people just may not have been paying attention to it on either side of it, either for the APIs they call in their apps or APIs they provide. So really appreciate you coming on the show to highlight this and talk about what the issue is and how you can protect yourself. What are some of the common, just for people who are like, well, I don't use APIs, what are some common uses of APIs that you see?
Well, wherever there's a need to use external data, that's not part of our application stack. I'll give an example which has really accelerated the use of it, and it relates to a presentation I've given in the past. Blockchain technology, for instance. Blockchain technology in its day-to-day operation, whatever it may be doing, often needs data that resides in legacy databases. Blockchain's still a fairly new technology. So in all those cases, there's a need to call out to external data sources to get the data that the blockchain technology needs. That's an example. But there's so many. Really, to put it in a nutshell, any application that needs data that doesn't reside within that company or that application stack, typically you're using an API to get that information, and vice versa. If you want to share information with others out there that they don't have in their application stack that you do, then that's the other end of using an API.
Yeah. So, for example, if you had an e-commerce app, you might want to track the package, or you might want to create a shipping label, and that would be an API call to FedEx's API or UPS's API.
Yeah, that's
whatever you're using for shipping. If you have an ERP system, there might be API access to their data. A newer one that's just come out is that whole artificial intelligence with the ChatGPT and OpenAI API. God, there's too many A's and I's in that sentence. And then, of course, anyone who uses Amazon AWS, they have about 40 different feature areas like image processing or video processing or, S3 buckets. All of that is available through APIs.
Absolutely. If I may, I'd like to give a little insight of my view of the evolution of that. Part of my work is stress testing and capacity planning and load testing. And in order to do that, what you typically do is you go to a URL and you record what comes back from both the request response to the URL. So, as an example, you're browsing a website to create a load testing script. When I used to do that, I could pretty much use those scripts. But once I'd finished browsing around, I could pretty much use those scripts immediately. Nowadays, 50% of the time in getting that to work is commenting out API calls, because if, for instance, if we want to do a load test with 100,000 virtual users, we don't want to be hitting some Google, for instance, or Facebook or whatever it may be, because then you're seen as a DDoS attack. So the reason I use that illustration is I've seen the proliferation of outcalls, particularly via APIs, mushroomed, in over the years.
Well, hopefully the mushrooms are growing on healthy soil and not some SHIT stuff that many mushrooms are grown on.
Well, true, but that's a good fertilizer anyway.
There you go. So what kind of attack methods have you seen out there in the wild in ColdFusion land?
Well, any problem that can apply to a URL, a typical website URL, can apply to an API. So all the typical attacks, man in the middle, phishing, anything that you can. I actually made it. I think you put some in the show notes, Michaela, but I actually, reveal pretty much most of them, when not all of them. It's basically the same, because what an API is, in essence, I'm being simplistic here, is a URL with a port assignment,
Mm-hmm.
But the point I want to make, which I think is important, is what tends to happen is that this is from a remote API perspective. So we're calling a remote API in code for some reason or other, and often that may change. But often the API call gets left in the code, even though it's not being used anymore. And if you think about it, all APIs, whether remote or local, are doorways or portals into and out of an application. And that's always, whichever way we're doing that, that's always a potential security risk. And I'm sort of doing a bit of marketing here, but that's why ever since API Manager, ColdFusion API Manager came out with ColdFusion 2016, I think. It got hardly any mention from. I think that it was Adobe at the time. It got hardly any mention, and immediately, because of my experience out in the field testing, I realised that it was a bloody amazing product and something that we should be using. But it just sort of laid fallow. It's still available with ColdFusion 2021, by the way, but I haven't found a lot of usage of it yet.
No, I interviewed Brian Zappi a few years ago when it came out, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes. And also Alicia Dvorak, who was an evangelist to the API Manager a few years ago on the business case for it. And I think you're right. Not so many people, they don't even realize they've got it. I think it ships when it first came out, it was with enterprise version of ColdFusion. I'm not sure if it's only enterprise now, if you get it with standard. I'm a little confused on that, but maybe we can figure that out and update the show notes at terratech.com with the correct info. Because I just tried to Google that before the interview and I couldn't find a clear answer.
Right.
Or any answer on that. So, but it's a great tool. It's a separate install from the ColdFusion install. It comes with ColdFusion. And I think really most people are either calling APIs or exposing stuff. And really the API is, like you say, it's a doorway. It's a back. Let's use a security term. It's like a back door into your app, and you've got to secure your back doors because it's exposing functionality. Even if it's not a security, it can be a security issue. They could start doing things to your app that you don't want to happen, right? But even if they just called it a whole bunch of time and it uses up a lot of database resources and CPU resources, it could cause you problems. So
that's right. Exactly.
Yeah, so API Manager lets you throttle down on how many requests are allowed from any particular person. And like you said earlier, they can have roles and credentials through it. So it's a very fine control. I can't think of the right word. Fine-toothed? No, that's the wrong word. It gives you a lot of control over API use both ways, the ones you call and the ones you expose.
Exactly.
This podcast is brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Get detailed show notes on today's episode and your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at terratech.com. That is TERATECH.com. And now back to today's show.
exactly. And it's and we see some of the horror stories of, I'm not saying API exploits, but it could have been. I mean, it's a little while ago now, but the fuel systems on the East Coast that got disrupted by a security attack and almost brought the coast of the States to a standstill. I'd like. Sorry, Michaela.
Yeah, go ahead.
I get enthusiastic. No, but I'd like to make a really overall point, which one of my sidelines, you could say. Another one is writing things, poetry and so on. But anyway, I'm writing a science fiction short story at the moment that talks about not APIs, but it talks about AI. But one of the main points I make in that is that pretty much everything everywhere needs software to do things. Even in sadly poorer countries, often cell phones are used, are a daily part of life. So one thing that is easy to forget. I mean, we work in software, so we know those things, but pretty much everything we depend on, it depends on software. That's really the nub of my short story. And that's changed dramatically in my lifetime. It's nonsense. The change is monumental. But the point I'm making is that means that everything we depend on, and these are obvious statements, has a potential security problem which could be devastating if it were exploited. So it's really important that we pay attention to these things, particularly when we're dealing with remote or offering remote capabilities.
Yes, unless you lock your servers up and don't give them internet access, you are going to have some kind of security concern.
Yeah.
So, and I do agree with you there. Most companies, and other organizations do depend on software. And, the internal IT and programming is critical to their business success.
Yeah, exactly.
And we often forget that, in some ways, like an automobile manufacturer like Ford or Tesla or whatever, really they're a software company that is selling cars on top. But a lot of modern products and services really are there's a lot of software involved in there. And then that's a whole security issue. And you really don't want your manufacturing plant to be brought to a standstill because it got hacked, or your product to be misused by someone hacking into the software.
Yeah, no, it's a constant and unfortunately never-ending issue. And that's a really good point you make. I mean, even just to amplify that a little, the fact that Tesla's really a software company, for instance, even standard manufacturers still producing gasoline or diesel vehicles, they're still their systems have lots and lots of chips in the in the vehicles, basically.
Yes, and in their manufacturing plant. I mean, I almost, although we get lots of cool features in modern products, whether they're cars or airplanes or whatever, from having software in there, in some ways, I kind of like having a car that I actually could do the repairs myself, because modern cars, you can't do that, because unless you have the computer software gizmos that you plug into them. And I think they don't let you do that at home. But it used to be you could just, repair anything on a refrigerator or a car. I mean, even refrigerators often have software in them now. It's like,
absolutely.
And I understand the benefit of that. Maybe it kind of saves energy, or maybe it reminds you to buy milk, on your cell phone because it tracks how much goes in and out of the fridge. So,
I have a friend. This is an interesting insight too. So I have a friend, and their son has a cell phone, and there's an app. There's an app now that runs on his cell phone, and probably the parent's cell phone too, that tracks where he is. And also even things like, but the battery's running low. In other words, it reports on the cell phone of the child, basically, in this case. But I did have another insight too. I used to, before I worked in technology, I actually worked in the vehicle business. I worked for British Leyland, and I'm sure you, Michaela, that they are, and for people in other places, things like Jaguar and Rover and Mini and so on, they were all British Leyland products. And yeah, I mean, I just to amplify what you said about repairing things, I've repaired many vehicles in my life, and typically it's hard to do that nowadays. But yeah, this is just amplifying how immersive our lives are in the software world. We're completely immersed in them, and again, all of that depends on a lot of it anyway, or most of it depends on API calls. So I'm just emphasizing things that I've emphasized before, I suppose.
Yeah. Now, fundamentally, an API is you send it some XML and it sends back some other XML. An XML is just text, is formatted text. So you can sort of imagine the naughty things a hacker could get up to by manipulating those XML packets. And,
Absolutely. And
on both ends, they could mess up the data you get back, but also, you can do SQL injection attacks or any of the other standard hacking things that probably many listeners are familiar with, denial of service or cross-site scripting.
Sorry.
And the issue is that the API call just goes into the middle of someone else's app, or it goes into the middle of your app. And you may not be thinking about protecting it as much as you would if it was a regular web form where to use, CF-param and all the other things you do to amp up your security. So,
yeah, and another point that I was going to make is there's also when data is in transmission. In other words, you've called out to an API and there's some data coming back. Often that can be in plain text, unless you unless you make just like a non-HTTPS call. Going back, so that's another level which API Manager can help with to make sure that everything that's submitted and received is is encrypted.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. So let's talk about you have quite a lot of ideas here on how you can protect your APIs in ColdFusion. Obviously, the first thing is install API Manager. Yeah. But what are the other things you think are important, Mike?
Do you mean beyond API Manager or within API?
No, well, what are the steps you suggest listeners take to make sure their API usage is secure?
Well, so that's a really great question. Even without API Manager, one of the things I definitely advise clients to do is do an inventory of the APIs that you're using. Both remote, called out, and what you're offering. Often, like I said, APIs get lost in the code and they get forgotten about. And I've actually had not ColdFusion clients, but I've actually had a client who got hacked like that. There was some APIs left exposed that weren't needed anymore. Some remote attacker found them and exploited that. So step number one, really critical, whether you're going to use API Manager or not, do an inventory of the APIs that you're using. That's the first critical step.
Does API Manager help with that if you've got an app where you don't remember what you've got? And
that's a good question, Mikhail.
Because I think it monitors all API use, doesn't it? Or am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. So I'll sort of corroborate that. But what that would involve is some sort of scan of current applications to see what APIs are in there, obviously. So I'll look at that. I imagine API Manager must have that capability, but I've not used it. If it does, but I'm sorry, I'm going on about this, but it's a really critical step. Let's first of all find out what APIs are being used, and
in your code, they're probably being used through CFHTTP calls.
Yes, exactly. So,
I'm sure there are other ways to do it, but 99.9% of people using APIs are using CFHTTP.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, because and I should be fair about that. ColdFusion in its own right has obviously things that can be done with with some of these things that I'm talking about. But it's more the fine grained stuff, which is also important. You mentioned one which is really important, Michaela, which is throttle the number of calls that can be used with that particular API, because that's a classic, and it's like DDoS attack. if you don't control the amount of, let's say you're offering an API, and you don't control the amount of traffic that can go through that API, then you're wide open.
Yeah. So one of the things API Manager lets you do is you can have users and roles and authentication, and then some users, maybe they're paying for API access and they can have a high volume. Maybe you have a free tier in your plan, and those people are limited. They can only make one call every so many seconds or whatever the restriction is.
Yeah.
And then also API Manager can report on how much API traffic you're getting from different users. So
yeah, that's a really good point. And I will make a more overall point on this, because again, these are things I've seen over the years. Logs. So let's say you were a security firm. Let's say that was your job in life. The first thing you're going to do if somebody gets exploited is you want to look at the logs. Most people never did. A lot of people, and I'm not criticizing it, it's just how pressured development is, and it gets more pressured as time goes by because there's more software out there. So most people don't even look at the logs. And again, I'm going to give an example. I've used lots of sophisticated tools over the years to monitor things like Fusion Reactor, C Fusion, etc. But I also always want to see the logs. That's really so. This is an overall point. Like I said, logs are critical, and ColdFusion has always had superb logging capabilities. So I'm just making a general point there. Take a look at the logs. Make it a habit to check them regularly. I mean, we had an issue very recently with a client who somehow or other the development environment got hacked, and by looking in the logs, we were able to at least identify when it happened. So that anyway, I won't go on about that. But logs are critical, and that's that's as you mentioned, speaking specifically of ColdFusion API Manager. There's a very good logging. What would I call it? A logging analysis component to API Manager, and that's important.
Yeah, so review the API logs. Make sure all your APIs have authentication, and so even for internal ones that you're only using between your own apps, it's wise to have authentication on those. So if something malicious got into your servers, they couldn't get to those API endpoints without a valid authentication.
Yeah, please, you continue.
Well, no, also, encrypting the traffic with TSL, so that people can't snoop on what's going backwards and forwards across the internet. What were you going to say about authentication and encryption?
Well, it's a bit of a joke. I mean, literally. So there's two security engineers talking about security, and one's full of himself, bragging and so on. He says, the security at my home is so good, I can't even get in anymore.
Right.
So everything's a balance, but we do tend to. And I want to just mention something because it's important, because I've said some things that sound critical, critical of others, not critical as a critical problem. The issue generally within technology is that, this is a general comment, an obvious one, really. Software's everywhere. I often think the worst software failure in history is the Boeing 737 MAX. That was purely a software problem. That's an aside. I just want to mention, and that is a classic example of what happens to developers. The developers of software, from what I've read, were pressured into releasing something that wasn't properly functional. So I just want to make this as a general statement. The pressure on development teams to get things out of the door as quickly as possible is still there, and if anything, it's more intense than it was. So things like API Manager, ColdFusion API Manager can help I mean, using API Manager, in my experience, is a lot. To achieve required levels of security is a lot easier than just trying to do it by standard ColdFusion code or any other. It's not just ColdFusion. I mean, obviously there's other software languages out there, and of course the other thing about API Manager is it's a standalone product, so it doesn't need to be. You could, a PHP shop could be using API Manager, for instance.
Or Java. I do know some people who use it with other other languages for that reason.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the other things folks listening can do to protect their APIs. So what about the privilege level on these exposed pieces of functionality through an API?
Yeah, well, are we talking just as a general comment here or specific to API Manager?
Well, either way.
Either way. Yeah, so basically, I mean, we're all familiar with those of us, that's a Northern Englishism. Those of us in the software world are obviously, aware of roles and, and permissions and so on. There was years ago, for those of us who've been around in ColdFusion for a while, there was Spectra was a product that came out, which was a CMS, if I remember that right. A pretty good one, actually, at that, as it happened. Eventually, I think it was Macromedia decided to kill development of it. But there was a thing in there called Advanced Security, which was LDAP based. And that was a classic fine-grained mechanism where you could control roles and permissions and so on and so forth. So that's a very important part of any application. And, that Advanced Security went away probably at the same time as Spectra. But the principles that are used inside of API Manager are those same sort of principles. So you can apply very fine. This is just API though. You can apply very fine-grained access permissions to all sorts of things. Directories. And that's again just speaking APIs because we are API Manager. Using API Manager makes it a lot easier to apply, a lot quicker to apply those sorts of controls on API code and everything that's related, because it's not just the API that gets exploited. The API is just a doorway. It's what access is allowed from that to other things inside the application stack and the environment,
No, it makes sense. So if you're exposing parts of your app, you might want to only give the privileges needed for that piece of database access. So not use the admin user for that. And then talking of exposing things, what are your thoughts on what data gets exposed through APIs?
Largely speaking, in my experience, it's RD, relational database management system type data, or it could be NoSQL, one or other of those two. A couple of things. I just had a little smile then when you mentioned administrator. So I still find, talking SQL Server here, I still find clients using SA as a user, which is it's like every door in the house and every window open. And of course, the other classic, these are asides, is select star, it still gets used widely, even in example code. But anyway, those are asides. So a lot of it is database, back-end database data. That's the majority of it. And I will amplify something else that was the subject of another presentation I made. In the blockchain world, and blockchain is expanding in use, constantly. Most of the data that's needed in blockchain-based applications is still not. It's outside in some relational database system or NoSQL. So again, it's another reason why the use of APIs has exploded. And I'm repeating myself here. And as you stated also, Michaela, AI is going to be. That's a slightly different type of data, you could say. But we're not. API use is not going anywhere soon. It's not going to reduce. It's not going to. Again, repetition here from me.
No, it's definitely increasing. It allows different systems to talk to each other effectively, hopefully in a secure way. I mean, that's what we're talking about. How do you keep it secure? I only see expanding. And then, if you are architecting using a microservice architecture, you've got all kinds of API calls going on, and you're exposing, with a monolith application, all the internal functionality is hidden. But when you do a microservice architecture, all your internal data and functionality is exposed, and you want to make sure you secure that. So coming back to the data, I think it makes sense. Only, share in the API, your APIs, the data required. Don't just dump back out all the data you have if it's not needed. It's just a security, risk to do that.
Yeah.
Now, what about validation? APIs get lots of parameters. What are your thoughts on the input validation?
Well, that's critical, because it's another form of control. If you're expecting a particular type of data, then you should be making sure that that's what you're getting. Which is a simplistic way of saying it. And I will mention another thing here, which I haven't really said, which is sort of obvious, but maybe not. Another key reason for the explosion, we'll say, in the use of APIs is it allows cross-language, software language communication. So you can call out from ColdFusion to a PHP application or an ASP application or Java or, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another reason that APIs have got so popular too. You can cross software languages because what you're doing, this is not the right set of words, but I'll use them anyway. You're sort of dumbing down the data so that it's, you mentioned one, which is XML, universal JSON's another. You're providing, you're providing formats that are readable across different software languages. But to go back to your point, you definitely want to make sure that if it's a remote API, that you're getting back what you're expecting to get back. Very important.
No, it makes sense. Yeah, because if you don't validate your inputs and outputs, people, hackers can sneak in stuff. And then if you're using that data further in your app, for example, you're using it in a SQL query, they could definitely be causing problems with SQL injection or other tricks.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
And I think people forget this. They think they're just exposing an API for themselves, for their, internal use, and they forget other malicious actors might get hold of that endpoint somehow and start making calls to it. So good to have a suspicious attitude here. Because basically, if you think about it, with a legacy app, you kind of have, you have a house with just one front door and it's secured, but with APIs, you're opening up all kinds of extra back doors into your app, and you've got now potentially hundreds or thousands of endpoints in your applications. So,
I mean, in the classic, and this happens with every software language out there. Legacy code gets left in there, that's not used anymore. There was an time and isn't anymore. And that's why I say that API, what's the word I'm looking for here? The audit of API use is really critical. Even if you're not, and I think I said already, but I'm going to repeat it. Even if you're not using ColdFusion API Manager, you need to audit what APIs you've got and whether they're still, yeah.
So let's talk a bit about denial of service attacks, because that's another way to cause problems. How do you suggest people deal with denial of service on their APIs? That someone's hammering away on that particular API deliberately to try and crash your app?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things there. So if you're using API Manager, ColdFusion API Manager, which I strongly recommend, then you can apply controls. We've mentioned them already. How many times can this API be called in a time period, for instance? The other classic, which I've talked about, even if you don't have API Manager in use, the logs. Because everything, the wonder of ColdFusion, I can't state this enough, is that the logs, from the beginning, for as long as I can remember, the logging's always been superb. The only downside of it is there's there's different logs. That would be to be honest, Michaela, that would, unless you've done it already, that'd be another good podcast, as a separate thing about the logs. So just to boil that down a bit, I'll just give a couple that are important. And this is answering your question about the denial of service attack, because you get all these things in the logs. So the best catch-all log in ColdFusion is called ColdFusion out.log. That's where you're going to get most information, which is of overall use to you. The next log that I like to look at, these are sort of general recommendations, is the application log, which has been around from the beginning. The ColdFusion out log, I'm just going to drink a little water here. ColdFusion out log came about when ColdFusion went to Java, which was ColdFusion 6 and 6.1. It's in essence a Java log. The out log is a Java log, but it's a good log to look at. Application log will show you things that are going wrong in the application from a code level, basically.
No, great to look at logs. So it's on the API Manager throttling and rate limiting. You've got pretty fine tooth control there of it. Limiting how many accesses each user can have. A user is someone who's authenticated to your API, and then you can limit how many accesses they can have per hour, per second, per minute, per day.
Right.
And you can either send notifications if they exceed it, or you can block them out if they're accessing it more than they're supposed to.
Yeah.
So
those are really powerful features, no doubt about it.
Yeah. So I'll put a link in the show notes to all that documentation. I think that's very important to turn that on for any API. You don't want people hammering your service, millions of times an hour or whatever with a distributed denial of service attack. What other steps do you think people should do to make their APIs more secure?
Again, if they're not using API Manager, we ColdFusion API Manager, there's obviously security best practices that can be, done in ColdFusion itself. There's no doubt about that. Again, I know I'm repeating myself again, but this is really important. Step one is let's figure out what APIs we're using and what APIs we're offering, and let's look at the code and see, do we still need those? And if we do, then what controls, this is again outside of API Manager, what controls can we apply within ColdFusion's capabilities itself? But again, as I say, flogging a dead horse. That audit is really important.
So before deploying your app to production, do an API audit, see what API calls you're making, and are they secure? Look at the calls you're exposing. Are they still used? And are they subsecure? And, make sure you've got API Manager set up for your production system. And for those who haven't used API Manager, you can either have a single instance, or you can have if you had a really high volume app, you can have a cluster of API managers controlling access to and from APIs in your app. So, and they have a Docker image. Adobe has a Docker image for API Manager if you're doing a cloud kind of deployment.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on web application firewalls?
Well, I think they're an essential item to use. There's quite a lot of I haven't done any hedge down development for years, but I am constantly seeing code, and applications on a daily basis. So web application firewalls are definitely something that I believe are a good thing to use if they're available,
So there are many out there. FuseGuard is a ColdFusion specific one. And basically what a WAF or a web application firewall does, it inspects all the requests being made, whether they're API or other requests, and then looks for malicious requests being sent, whether they're cross-site scripting or SQL injection or the locate. Sometimes you filter out certain countries that if you don't have any users in North Korea, then maybe you just filter out all the packets coming from that country or whichever countries you feel are inappropriate. So that's another layer of security on that both protects API access and regular form or URL access to your app.
Right.
Go ahead. Sorry, you wanted to add something to?
No, I was just agreeing with you.
So the other thing in API Manager is that you've got a whole notification set of things when people do things they shouldn't be doing, whether they're exceeding their throttling limits or doing, naughty things. Or using a lot of CPU. So.
Yeah, well, that's another aspect too, because we haven't touched on that, but I'll just touch on it quickly, and that's performance. Because it's not just security ramifications if somebody's trying to do something they shouldn't. It can also, slow your application, your internal application down if something's not controlled properly.
No, that makes sense. So, any other thoughts on API security or use you want to share?
I think basically we've gone through a lot of them, and the notes that you've kindly made, cover them to be followed up, and generally outside of APIs, just generally securing applications is incredibly important, and again, often due to pressure of work. It's something that to this I'll amplify this even more. Most applications, and this is again multi-language, most applications that get out there are never adequately tested, which is security being part of it because of the pressure of work. Get things out. I think it was, I can't remember who it was that said, this is years back, it might have been Hal Helms. There was another ColdFusion luminary, that 70% of software applications fail. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean they fail completely. It means that they fail, I don't know if graceful is the right word, but, often most applications still to this day get out there when they shouldn't be there. And I'll repeat myself again, the most tragic example of that was the Boeing Max.
Yeah, there's all kinds of software issues out there, and some of them can cause people to lose their lives or lose a lot of money. All kinds of things can happen. So I would say when you're writing a ColdFusion app or maintaining an app, which we do a lot of at TerraTech, maintaining and modernizing other people's ColdFusion apps, it's good to pay attention to security when you're writing the app. If you've inherited an app, then API Manager is a great way to add a layer of security to your API use, and then go back and do all the suggestions you had about looking at the APIs. Are they still used? Are the inputs validated? Are you only sending out the minimal amount of data and using a minimal amount of access to your data that's required? So, a lot of good things to do there. I'll put the links to download the API Manager and the documentation in the show notes, and I'll also put a link to your prior episode on the blockchain, because I know you're keen on ColdFusion and blockchain programming. So
yeah, well, I just think it just as an overall, and I know you're deeply involved in this, Michaela, but the good news is ColdFusion has been around a long time. Unfortunately, the bad news is ColdFusion has been around a long time. And it gets a bad rap from that standpoint. And I mean, it's been great to me for many years, and to me, it's a very current and significant programming paradigm. ColdFusion, I'm talking about, and and I'm going to make one point which is probably mildly controversial. I mean, just to sort of emphasize how important and how relevant ColdFusion is. People are still buying licenses for it. PHP and so on and so forth. You don't need licenses for. But if ColdFusion isn't still relevant, why are people still buying it?
Oh no, it's still very relevant. We do an annual State of the ColdFusion Union survey, and we get a lot of feedback on there. It's still a widely used language. It's hard to get a grip on exactly how many users there are, but I'm going to guess around 100,000 out there. Part of the issue is that from research I've done, for every one site on the public internet, there are 3 sites that are inside intranets that are private or extranet, where you have to have credentials to get in, and they just don't get picked up by these, what language is being used. And then with modern ColdFusion apps, you don't expose the file extensions CFM on the website, so you can't tell what language is being written in. And a lot of these sites that claim to say, "Oh, this was written in Java or ColdFusion or .NET," they just get it wrong. I mean, I looked with Brad Wood deeply into this for one of those sites. I better leave it nameless because it made such a dog's dinner of doing it. But we fed it, you could feed it a URL and it would tell you what technology was used. And we fed it a ColdFusion site and it said, "Oh yeah, this was written in .NET." And it's like, no, it wasn't. It may be running IIS underneath ColdFusion. Maybe that's why you think it was written using .NET, but it's actually using Adobe ColdFusion, or in another case, it was using Lucy. And we did try to communicate with their tech support, but didn't get anywhere with it.
Yeah, it's a classic example. It's a bit like, I always get suspicious of things like surveys when, 30% of 8 billion people did that. Right? It takes a long time to do 8 billion people. I will make another point, though, which is sort of off topic, but important, I think. A lot of people think that, ColdFusion has lost some momentum. PHP were probably the main, entity responsible. But it's more than that. The largest single attack surface in web technology is WordPress.
Well, it's very popular,
right.
Content management system.
But what I'm going to say, Mikhail,
we did look at, I think it was it, I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was CNET data. Anyway, it was someone who'd analyzed the number of hacking attacks on different languages. And ColdFusion, I think, was the second most secure language out there. And I know for a fact that Adobe put an enormous amount of effort into making ColdFusion secure, not just with this API manager that they released in 2016, but also in the ColdFusion language. And, they're all over any, security issue in ColdFusion. They actually have a full-time person. I think it's called the ColdFusion Security Czar, or I forget her exact title, and they take it very seriously because a lot of organizations use ColdFusion. Security is incredibly important to them, and that's one of the reasons they keep using it. And then the other point I just want to make for APIs is ColdFusion is really good at both consuming and generating APIs or exposing APIs, and makes it most modern languages let you do that. But the point is ColdFusion makes it very easy in code to both consume and expose APIs. So it's a great glue language for doing blockchain or AI or AWS stuff because of that. And with the API manager, you can do it in a secure way. So,
right.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking about API security and API Manager and all the other topics we covered, Mike. If folks want to reach you online, what are some good ways for them to find you?
So the main website I'm running at the moment is called jvmwhisperer.com. So it's like CF Whisperer, who is one of my other alter egos. But I focus there on, certainly ColdFusion things in there and Java generally, the JVM in particular. So that's my main website in terms of the software world nowadays. I'm pretty active on Facebook and Twitter, and I think CF Whisperer is my Twitter handle. I'm on GitHub too, as CF Whisperer. LinkedIn, I can't remember my LinkedIn because it's got some sort of numeric appendage which I can't recall. But yeah, I'm pretty much active on all, and obviously technology is a big part of my life. You mentioned also permaculture, Michaela, which is basically regenerative agriculture on a smaller scale, and music. Yeah, I mean, I'm on SoundCloud. That one's Coopera. I can note all these down anyway, but yeah, there's a few different ways.
Yeah, we'll put all of those in the show notes so that the CF Whisperer one is the easiest way to find you for people to remember. A whisperer is, I guess, a horse whisperer is someone who can heal horses and listens to them healing. So a CF Whisperer, you kind of listen to ColdFusion servers and can find out what's wrong with them. Yeah,
I'll give you a quick, but it is quick. So that all came about because I was working with a wonderful team in Los Angeles, actually, and this was a long time job, not a one-off task. Anyway, the point is, this lady there, she watched me for a while, and then she said, you should call yourself CF Whisperer. So that's where it came from, which was a nice compliment, because I do have a it's Valentine's Day, so I can say this. I do have an intimate relationship with ColdFusion servers.
Well, hopefully it's very loving. So appreciate you coming on the show, Mike, and good luck with all your projects.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate the opportunity and wish all the ColdFusioners out there all the best.
Get detailed show notes on today's episode and your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at teratech.com. That is teratech.com. Viva la CF Alive Revolution!